One of the statistics that comes out of the Center for Disease Control is that only 1 out of 3 people today has a clear reason to get up in the morning. 1 out of 3. So look at the person on your left for a minute here. See if they look like they had a reason to get up this morning. Look at the person on your right. They look pretty good. Maybe you are the 1 out of 3 who knows, and maybe they're here for different reasons. But I have been leading walking trips in Africa for the last 3 decades. I actually got over there through Outward Bound and a board of trustees to climb Kilimanjaro and raise money for Outward Bound and to visit the African Outward Bound School in Tanzania. So a scene like the one behind me here is very familiar to me. And I've been sitting under these baobab trees for many, many years with different people from different tribes. And a couple of years ago, I was sitting under this baobab tree, and we were actually around a fire. And a hunter-gatherer from a tribe called the Hadza. The Hadza are one of the last of the hunter-gatherer tribes on Earth. And his name is Kampala. And I was interviewing Kampala about how they had survived all these years. 100,000 years they've been around. You could call them our ancestors, like National Geographic does. And how they survive and how they've thrived all these years. And he's getting a little tired of my interview. So he suggests, Richard, can we step away from the fire for a few minutes, kind of under the baobab here, and I'd like to ask you a question. You've been asking us all these questions. And he says this, he says, Richard, do you know what the 2 most important days in your life are? And I said, sure. So what would you say? I said, birth and death. And he went, oh, geez. You know, you came all the way out here on an airplane, drove out here in a Land Rover, you're sleeping in that nice tent over there and all of this, and you don't know the answer to the 2 most fundamental questions that have helped us thrive for all these years. And I said, well, Kampala, what is the answer? And he said, birth is, you got that right. The second most important day in your life is the day you determine why you're born, how you fit in, what you're here to do and be in the tribe. That's the power of purpose. That's the fundamental, studying it all over the world. In neuroscience labs, in philosophy and theology departments, here I am with a hunter-gatherer who's a wise elder, who's never been more than 25 kilometers away from where we're sitting. And he comes up with the same basic fundamental. Purpose is fundamental. It's fundamental to our health, as I said, and our happiness. Imagine a pill that would aid cognitive decline by as much as 40 or 50%, Alzheimer's, that would reduce macroscopic stroke by 40%, that would aid sleep and sleep apnea, and would add 7 years to your life. Imagine a pill like that. How much would you pay for that pill? Well, that pill's free. It's called purpose. The neuroscience labs are now making it self-evident that we need a reason to get up in the morning. It's fundamental, it's essential. So let's look at how to unlock that purpose. I've also been walking across the plains of Africa, in addition to sitting under trees with elders, walking with elders across, and so this scene is from the Serengeti Plains, the edge of the Serengeti in Tanzania, East Africa. Walking along, picture this, that you're walking along with this man. His name is Koye. He's a wise elder from the Maasai tribe, different tribe than the Hadza. And he's walking along, and he's looking over his shoulder at me because I'm carrying a backpack that's loaded. And that pack is loaded with everything we need for a 10-day walking trip along the plains. So picture that off to your left here is the Serengeti with 1.5 million wildebeests and predators, and off to the right is the Kilimanjaro and Oldonyo-Lingai and the Great Mountains. And we're in the green hills in between where the Maasai live. And as we're walking along, he keeps looking over his shoulder, noticing that I'm not noticing what's on my left or right. I'm looking at the ground in front of me. You ever had days like that? We call it slogging, putting one foot in front of the other. And so we get to the camp where we're going to camp that night, And all of a sudden, Koye comes over to me and he says, you know, all of you are carrying these packs. What are you carrying? What's in these things? And I said, well, let me show you. So I put it on the ground, put a little tarp down, take everything out of my pack. Out comes the wilderness first aid kit. Out comes the root finders and water filters and Gore-Tex clothes. And I'm trying to explain Gore-Tex in Swahili. I can't even explain it in English. And so we have this pile, and all these little kids are looking at it. And all of a sudden, he comes over to me and says, as only wise elders can do, he whispers in my ear and he says, Richard, tell me, does all this make you happy? And I thought, well, maybe happy. And I looked at it and said, I'm carrying twice as much as I need here to be really happy or safe for the trip ahead. So I came out to the fire that night and I talked to the folks around the fire, picture yourself, and I said, I'm going to leave half of my stuff at the village, which I ended up doing, and just take what's essential for the journey ahead. And so repack your bags became the mantra for the rest of that trip, because people talked about repacking their life bags, getting to a certain point in life where we need to set down what we're carrying, look inside, and look at what's fundamental for the next phase of the journey. Well, purpose is fundamental for the next phase of the journey. Purpose is our aim, not our goal, but our aim, our trajectory in certain ways. So there are three fundamentals in your bag, I believe. And I call them the 3 M's: money, medicine, and meaning. Money is fundamental. How much is enough is different for all of us in terms of how we determine success. Medicine is code for health. You can have enough money, but what you need is the health to enjoy that money and to live a long, vital life. But the third M isn't always talked about. People think if I have enough money and I have enough health, everything will be fine. But the third M is meaning. Meaning is our reason to get up in the morning. And it is as fundamental as the other two. You all know somebody, and you may be one of those somebodies, who hit a certain inflection point in their life and metaphorically put down their bag to look at what's next in life. And those are the 3 fundamentals that we need for the next phase of our lives. So let me leave Africa and come into this country. I travel quite a bit, and I land on a hot, steamy July day, and I get into a cab, and to get out of Boston Airport, you have to go through a tunnel. So we get into the tunnel, and all of a sudden the red lights go, doot, 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 you know how that is, and you say, uh-oh, so there's an accident or there's a stoppage. And the cab driver says, Mister, I saw this earlier today, they're doing construction equipment on the other side here. This could be a while. So I said, do you mind rolling up the windows if we're going to be in here? And I checked my watch, and clock's ticking. I have to be somewhere at noon. It's now 10:45. And I said, would you mind rolling up the windows? He said, the AC doesn't work. Do you want to die of heat or asphyxiation? And I said, heat. And so up come the windows. We're sitting there sweating, and the cab driver, a prototypic cab driver like he's in the movies, little cigar he's chewing on, little hat, refrigerator plugged into the cigarette lighter to keep his beverages cold, his tabloids from his teams, all his religious iconography on the dashboard. And so he turns around and he says to me, Richard, he didn't call me Richard, he called me Mister at that point. He said, Mister, what's the title of your speech? And I said, my speech is called Whistle While You Work. And he turned around and he looked at me like he just picked up an alien from another planet. He said, give me a break. Get real. Whistle while you work. Do people actually do that? And I said, well, I think so, and I'm doing research on it, and I've interviewed hundreds of people on this, and I said, I really don't want to give the speech twice, once to you and once to them. Do you mind if I ask you 3 questions, 3 fundamental questions? And he said, yeah, whatever. So I said, first question is, and so I'm asking you the same questions that I'm asking the cab driver. Now, picture yourself just having this conversation. And I said, number 1, do you love what you do? 1 to 10. 1 meaning no, 10 meaning yes, somewhere in between. Do you love what you do? Whatever your work is, whether it's volunteer work, community work, paid work, 1 to 10. He said 1. Mister, I do this to make a living, to pay the mortgage. I said, fair enough. Second question. I asked him then, 1 to 10. Is there any part of your day where you really love what you do? Just a portion where you lose all track of time. And you're in the zone, as they say, and the clock is just meaningless at that point. And he went, 1. So I got 2 ones going for me now with this guy. I said, then he said, but mister, I know what you're talking about because I coach kids soccer at night. And I love being out on the field. They have to turn the lights off and kick me out and send me home because I'm in the zone and I'm so into it. So I understand what you're talking about. But in terms of my paid work, 1. So then I asked him the third question. And the third question is, are there any people you love driving or serving more than others? Kind of like the environment, the culture, 1 to 10. He pauses and he said, 10. I went, 10? Can you tell me a little more about that? And he said, I love older women. I went, oh no, I'm in the tunnel with someone I don't want to know the story about. And he said, no, it's not what you think. I picked up an older lady this morning, same place I picked you up at the airport. I drove her to get her groceries. I took her to her senior assisted living. I helped her get her groceries up. I helped her get her key in the door. And he's going on and on about this older 85-year-old woman. And I said, well, are you related? And he said, no, she just doesn't drive anymore. They took her keys away every time she goes anywhere. Opera, store, airport, she calls me, I'm her guy. And I said, well, are there any other people like that? Or is this kind of like one of a kind or a relative? And he said, all the ladies in her senior assisted living facility call me, I'm their driver. And I said, well, you got a calling. He said, some people have jobs. Some people have careers. Some people have callings. And callings are when you really bring your gifts, your passions, and your values together into your work, into your life. He said, no, only priests have callings. I said, no, you got a calling. It's giving care to older women. So let's look, and so we drove out of the tunnel. I made it to my speech, and I said, I'm going to write up your story in a book, which I did. I just wrote it up as the opening story in a book that is coming out actually next month called Work Reimagined. And he said, am I famous? I said, well, I don't know. But I said, you'll be fundamentally more happy if you bring more of who you are to what you do, which is really what calling is about. So let's look at your calling. Here's the Napkin Test. I call this the Got a Minute School of Coaching. Because in a world today where everybody's online all the time, I don't know where your cell phone is at the moment, but hopefully it's parked, but where we're on 24/7, I hear this kind of notion from people. They say, Richard, have you got a minute? Can you tell me what I ought to do with the rest of my life? And I said, well, if you only have a minute, have you got a napkin? Can you write down this formula on a napkin? Because this is what you need to really look at. So the napkin test for you is this. And this is the napkin test. This is what I did actually with the cab driver without the napkin itself. Gifts plus passions plus values equals calling. Are you using your gifts on things you feel passionate about in environments that fit your values? That's the bottom line today, I believe, of happiness, fulfillment, productivity, and many other things. So the napkin test is, you do it yourself, but you have the conversation with other people and talk about this in certain ways. If someone in your family, spouse, partner, child, grandchild, friend, colleague, is struggling at that inflection point in their life where they're looking at what's next. We spend 60% of our life working. 60% of our life is spent working in one way or another. And so it's the hugest investment of our most precious currency, our time. And so when people say, well, it's a job, and I get my fulfillment elsewhere, I said, 60% of your investment is doing something that you're getting about a 15% time payoff from. You ought to at least take a look at that. Callings are from cradle to grave. We need to stop, push the pause button, step back, and look at the napkin test on a regular basis. I walked into a bookstore recently, and I do all the time. I go wherever. I'm a bookstore junkie. I love books, and I love to hold them, and I love to go in and see if they're carrying my books, of course. And I went into a bookstore, and it was in Denver, big bookstore, and I asked the woman at the information desk, I said, "Can you tell me where the self-help section is?" And she paused, and she looked at me, and she said, "Well, if I tell you, won't that defeat the whole purpose?" Well, it was a very good response, one that got me thinking, because this whole business of self-help, don't go it alone. Whether it's the napkin test or looking at the next phases of our life, isolation is fatal. We need to stop and reflect, do our own self-help, but we also need to look at our lives as reflected in community and reflected in family. So thank you so much for being here today, and thank you for the generosity of your listening. If my purpose is to help others unlock their purpose, if I was able to help one of you today, this will be a well-lived day for me. Thank you so much.